A lot of us wonder where the rapture will happen. However, I think we might have a clue today when we parallel Matthew 24 and Revelation chapter 6 and 7. So, stay tuned and see what you think.
Holy Spirit, come and refresh me. Holy Spirit, come.
Welcome to Through the Bible in 5 Minutes. I'm your host, Brad Keeney. And today we're going to be doing a little different. We normally like to do line-by-line, chapter and verse Bible studies through the Bible. However, today we're going to be paralleling as a special discussion topic, is what we call them, with Revelation. We're going to look at Matthew 24 and what Jesus said, and compare that to Revelation chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7, and see if there's a clue to maybe when the rapture is going to happen. Now, we can't know the time or the date or the hour of when Jesus is going to come back or when the rapture is going to happen exactly. But we can have clues maybe in how it fits in the chronology, and that's kind of what I'm looking at here. And again, I want you to pray about it, see what the Holy Spirit shows you. I'm not positive that this is the answer, but it's very compelling evidence as we're going to look at multiple points, 7 different parallel points in order that lead up to an event that appears like us being gathered in heaven. At any rate, I better get started because this one's going to be kind of long. Again, not like our normal 5 or 6 minutes. And I also wanted to say up front, I need to have 2 Bibles in front of me. So I've got a ESV study Bible over here with Matthew in it, and I've got a New King James MacArthur study Bible with Revelation in it. So the ESV will be used for Matthew, the New King James for Revelation, just because I need to have 2 Bibles in front of me. So that's why the translational differences. I think they're both good translations. As you know, New King James is my favorite, but let's get started. So when we start originally with Matthew 24, we're going to see, remember, Jesus comes out of the temple, and the disciples basically come to him privately saying, tell us when these things will be and what will be a sign of your coming and the coming of the end of the age. So in verse 4 is where we see our first clue. It says, and Jesus answered them, come and see that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will lead many astray. Well, if we go over here to Revelation chapter 6, verse 1, we see in the first seal it says, now when I saw the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard, excuse me, one of the 4 living creatures saying with a loud voice and thunder, come and see. And then in verse 2 we see, I looked and behold a white horse, and he who sat on had a bow. Notice he doesn't have an arrow. And a crown was given to him. And he went out conquering and to conquer. Now remember, Jesus doesn't need to be given a crown. Most people will agree, pretty much everybody in the Christian circles I know agree, that this is actually the Antichrist. So that would be a false Christ, which is what Jesus was talking about. So let's go on to point 2. Point 2, it comes in Matthew 24:6. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. Well, if we go for point 2, we go to Revelation 6:4 now. And in Revelation 6:4, we see in the second seal, and another horse, fiery red, went out and was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another. Well, that's war. So we see false Christ, we see war. So what's our next point? The next thing Jesus talked about in verse 7 of Matthew 24:7, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, there's the wars, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Those earthquakes will pop up later, but famines is a key here. In Revelation chapter 6, verse 6, we see, also in the third seal here, it says, and a black horse went out, and in verse 6 it says, and I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. So here we see, we basically have famine. We're paying a lot of money for wheat and oil and barley. So there's our third point. We go to our fourth point. It comes in Matthew chapter 24, verse 9. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, is what Jesus says. Well, just so we don't skip over anything, the fourth seal, we have the pale horse and we have death that comes in Hades following, and we've already talked about wars and rumors of wars. So what we're doing now is we're jumping, that's the fourth seal, we're jumping right to the fifth seal, but I don't want to miss anything and be dishonest by skipping and not addressing it. But in the fifth seal, we see in 6:9 of Revelation, when I opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony with which they held. So we hear Jesus warning us that we're going to be put to death in Matthew, and here we see us being put to death. So our next point we're going to look at, though, we have another one of those skips. So I want to cover over what we're talking about here, and he's giving us different details that don't show up here, and I want to be honest about that. But let's hit those briefly so you know where we're at, because what happens next in Revelation is very chronological and right away. Here we're going to get more details that don't necessarily cross over, so I want to make sure I address. So what we have is in Matthew 24, verse 11, many false prophets. Verse 14, we have this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed, and the end will come, then the end will come. We see in verse 15, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, we also see addressed in verse 21, for then there will be great tribulation as the world has never seen before. In verse 24, it says, for false Christs and false prophets. We already talked about that some. But again, I wanted to make sure I'm not jumping anything. And then in verse 27, it says basically Jesus is going to come back as lightning flashes from the east to the west. Because our next point is in verse 29. So in Matthew chapter 24, verse 29, Jesus says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, remember that, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. That's important. So where do we have that here? Well, it's next in line. The next thing that pops up is in the sixth seal, in Revelation chapter 6, verse 12, and he opened and looked the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake. We talked about that earlier. The sun became black as sackcloth. Well, there's the sun. And the moon became like blood. Well, there's the moon. And the stars from heaven fell. Well, there's the stars and the heavens being shaken. So again, we have another parallel here, and it's in order, although there are some details that we covered. Now in verse 30, what's the next thing comes for our sixth parallel. Then there will appear in heaven a sign of the Son of Man. So there's a sign of him, almost like his face or something. And all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man, is what it says. So again, it's like his face or his coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So that's, again, Matthew 24:30. Well, the next thing we see over here in Revelation chapter 6, verse 15 is, and the kings of the earth, and the great men of the earth, and the rich men, and the commanders, and the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in caves and rocks and mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? So it sounds like they're seeing Jesus coming, and they're mourning, which is what we saw over in Matthew. So that brings us to our seventh parallel here. And this is an interesting one, as in Matthew chapter 24, verse 31 we see. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call. Remember, the last trumpet we talk about. And they will gather his elect from the four winds. Okay, so now do we see over here in Revelation a gathering per se? Actually, what we see is the result of a gathering. Let's go to chapter 7, and where we have a little chunk here, a few verses we're going to skip, so I want to make sure I cover those. Again, chapter 7, we see the four angels gathered together from the four winds, and they say, don't blow on the earth, don't harm anything, till we mark our people. And it says, in basically verse 5, it says, from the tribe of Judah, 12,000. And basically we have the 144,000 being marked, so that's what's going on. But what I wanted to, and that's chapter 6 and chapter 7, or excuse me, verse 6, verse 7, verse 8. But what I want to get to is chapter 7, verse 9. Because here's where I think we see the next thing in line being us being gathered. And that is, after these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, from all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. So there we have it. In order, 7 events that seem to lead to us showing up in the throne room in heaven. And then Jesus telling us about it before. So you chew on that, pray about it. God bless, and thank you for joining us on Through the Bible in 5 Minutes under our special discussion topics.